Hey, everybody, and welcome to another deep dive. You ready to get psychological with it today? Because we are going to
Right.
dive into some fascinating books and articles about the mind, about how we think about how we make decisions.
Yeah.
And I thought we could start with this idea of like expert intuition. Have you ever seen somebody
Absolutely.
who just like knows something instantly and you're like, how did you
What seems like magic,
know that? Yeah.
right? Like they've got some sort of superpower or a sixth sense.
Mm.
It's so fascinating how often people think experts have some kind of secret superpower.
Well, let's demystify that a little bit today.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think a good way to think about it is to think about pattern recognition. So it's not magic. It's really just about
Okay.
recognizing patterns and making connections based on tons of experience.
Okay, so break this down for me. Like, how does that actually work?
Okay, so think of a chess grandmaster. Herbert Simon was a researcher who studied expertise, and he said that chess masters don't see the board like you or I do. They've seen so many games that they instantly recognize patterns and possibilities. It's like their brain goes, I've seen this setup 1,000 times before.
Right.
Here's what usually happens next.
So it's not magic, it's just a supercharged brain that's been trained over time.
Exactly. Intuition is just recognition based on tons of stored information.
Hmm.
Daniel Kahneman, who wrote Thinking Fast and Slow, has a great way of putting it. He says, intuition is thinking that you know something without knowing why you know it.
That's a great quote. It's like when you meet someone and instantly get a good or bad feeling about them. You
Right.
can't really explain it,
Exactly.
but it's just there.
And that's where those two systems in our brains come into play that Kahneman talks about. System one
Okay.
is that fast gut feeling system.
Okay.
And then system two is slower
More analytical
and more deliberate.
more analytical. System one would be like that initial impression you get about somebody.
Exactly.
And the system two is when you actually start to like,
Yeah, you start to think things through.
process information and maybe get to know them.
You get to know them a little better and weigh the pros and cons.
So basically, don't always trust your gut,
Mm,
especially if you haven't had a lot of experience in that area.
you got it. And here's another interesting thing that Kahneman found is this idea that repeated exposure to something can make us believe it's true, even if it's not.
Okay.
He says a reliable way to make people believe in falsehoods is frequent repetition,
Mm.
because familiarity is not easily distinguished from truth.
Whoa. So you're telling me that if I hear something enough times,
Yeah.
I'm more likely to believe it, even if it's a lie.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that's exactly what the research shows.
It's kind of unsettling,
It is. It's one of the reasons why propaganda can be so effective.
right?
Repeat a message often enough and people start to accept it without question.
Wow. That makes me think about all the misinformation that's flying around these days.
It's everywhere.
Yeah, it's everywhere. The whole cognitive ease thing, it's like our brains are wired to take shortcuts,
Right.
even if those shortcuts lead us down the wrong path.
Yeah, we're always looking for ways to conserve energy.
Right.
And sometimes that means taking mental shortcuts.
That makes sense. So these shortcuts, they often come in the form of what we call cognitive biases, right?
Exactly. They're essentially systematic errors in thinking that arise from our brain's attempt to simplify the world.
So they're like glitches in our thinking
Yeah, glitches, mental glitches.
that make us misjudge things. Okay, I'm sure I've fallen for a few of these. Tell me about these glitches. What are some of the most common ones?
Okay. Well, one of the most common is the representativeness heuristic. And that's our tendency to judge something based on how well it matches our existing stereotypes.
Stereotypes.
Right.
You know, like judging a book by its cover.
Exactly. And Kahneman gives this great example in his book. He describes this guy named Tom W., who is described as really smart but not very creative.
Okay.
When people are asked to guess what Tom studies in grad school, they often pick computer science or engineering. Why? Because it fits the stereotype.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I see where you're going with this. So we rely on stereotypes even when we don't have all the facts.
Right. And we often ignore statistical probabilities, which Kahneman calls base rates.
Okay.
So even if computer science has a relatively small number of grad students overall,
Right.
we still think Tom is likely in that field because of the stereotype.
It's like our brains are saying, forget the numbers. I've got a good story here.
Exactly. We love a good story.
That's so true.
Yeah.
Another example of this is the Linda problem, right?
Yes. The Linda problem is a classic example of the representativeness heuristic at work.
So tell me about Linda.
Okay, so imagine you're given a description of a woman named Linda who's passionate about social justice and very outspoken.
Okay.
People are then asked, which is more probable, that Linda is a bank teller or that she's a bank teller who's active in the feminist movement?
Okay. So logically, it's more likely that she's just a bank teller, right?
You're absolutely right.
Because being a feminist bank teller is a subset of all bank tellers.
Exactly. But most people choose the second option, the one that's statistically less likely.
Really?
Why? Because it fits the image of Linda that they've created in their minds. They've fallen victim to the representativeness heuristic.
So our intuition can actually lead us to make choices that go against logic and statistics.
It can, and it does more often than we'd like to think.
That's kind of mind-blowing. All right, I need a minute to process, Adi. Before we jump into another one, let's switch gears for a bit.
Okay.
I recently read this book called The Psychopath Test,
Yeah.
and it really got me thinking about how much psychology plays a role in understanding people who operate outside the norms.
Yeah, psychopathy is a fascinating and complex topic. It's often misunderstood, with people assuming that all psychopaths are violent criminals.
Right?
But in reality, it's much more nuanced than that.
That's what the book really drove home for me. It introduces Bob Hare,
Right.
who developed the PCLR checklist, which is a tool for assessing psychopathic traits.
Yeah, the PCLR is the most widely used tool for assessing psychopathy.
And it's pretty intense stuff.
It is. It looks at a wide range of traits like superficial charm, lack of empathy, manipulativeness, impulsivity, and many more.
Okay. So it's not just about being like a serial killer.
No, not at all. It's important to note that not everyone who exhibits some of these traits is a psychopath.
Right.
It's the combination and severity that matters.
The book also highlights the debate about whether psychopathy is even treatable.
Right. There's a lot of controversy around that.
Yeah. You've got Elliot Barker, who ran this controversial program at Oak Ridge.
Yeah.
And he believed in using unconventional methods like nude encounter groups to try to foster empathy.
Interesting approach.
And then you've got Bob Hare, who takes a much more skeptical view,
Right.
arguing that psychopaths are master manipulators.
Yeah, they'll exploit any system.
Who will exploit any system designed to help them.
Yeah,
It's a fascinating dilemma.
it is.
It really made me question my own assumptions about good and evil.
Yeah. That's the power of psychology, right? It challenges our perceptions and makes us think differently about ourselves and the world around us.
Absolutely. Speaking of challenging perceptions, let's go back to Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow for a minute.
Okay.
He talks about this illusion of control, this idea that we often overestimate our ability to predict and influence events.
Oh, yeah. We love to think we're in the driver's seat.
Right. It's like that old saying, man plans, God laughs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We love to think we have control, but so much of life is beyond our control.
So true. Kahneman says the illusion that we understand the past fosters overconfidence in our ability to predict the future.
Oh, that's a good one.
Ouch. That's a bit humbling.
It is.
One example of this is the planning fallacy, right?
Yes. The planning fallacy is a classic example of the illusion of control at work.
We consistently underestimate the time costs and risks of projects,
All the time.
even when we have evidence from the past that suggests otherwise.
Yeah, we're really bad at learning from our past mistakes.
I am so guilty of this.
Yeah.
I always think I can get way more done in a day
Right.
than is humanly possible.
It's that optimism bias.
It's that optimism bias.
It can be both a blessing and a curse.
It keeps us motivated,
Yeah, it helps us stay motivated.
but it can also lead us to make some pretty bad decisions.
For sure. So how do we balance that optimism with a healthy dose of realism?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right. That's what we all want to know.
Kahneman suggests this technique called reference class forecasting. Have you ever heard of this?
I have. It's a really useful tool.
So tell me about it.
So basically, it involves looking at similar projects from the past
Okay.
and using that data to make more realistic predictions.
So instead of relying on my own overly optimistic estimates,
Right.
I should look at how long similar projects actually took other people.
Exactly. It's a way of grounding our predictions in reality rather than wishful thinking.
Okay. This is all starting to make me question my ability to make good decisions.
Well, we all fall prey to these biases.
Yeah.
The key is to be aware of them and try to mitigate their influence.
So knowledge is power.
Exactly.
Yeah.
By understanding how our minds work, we can make better decisions, improve our relationships, and live more fulfilling lives.
I'm feeling slightly more optimistic now after hearing that. But before we wrap up this first part of our deep dive, I have to ask, are there any experts who are actually good at predicting the future?
That's a great question. And Kahneman talks about this researcher named Philip Tetlock who studied political forecasting.
Okay.
And Tetlock tracked the predictions of hundreds of experts
Wow.
over many years and found that their accuracy was often no better than chance.
So even experts get it wrong.
They do, and sometimes they get it wrong a lot.
That's reassuring in a way.
I think so.
I mean, made me feel a little bit better about my own inability to predict the future.
Yeah, we're all in the same boat.
So what about these hedgehogs and foxes I keep hearing about?
Oh, yes. The hedgehogs and the foxes.
What's that all about?
So Tetlock found that certain types of experts, those he called hedgehogs,
Okay.
were particularly bad at predicting events.
So what makes someone a hedgehog?
Hedgehogs are people who tend to view the world through the lens of a single grand idea. They're often ideologically driven and resistant to changing their minds.
Oh, I know the type. They
Yeah.
always have an answer, even if it's completely wrong.
Exactly. And then there are the foxes who are more open-minded,
Okay.
willing to consider multiple perspectives and less wedded to a single theory.
So are the foxes any better at predicting the future?
They tend to be slightly more accurate than the hedgehogs,
Okay.
but even their predictions are far from perfect.
Right. Predicting complex events is incredibly difficult,
It is.
even for the most knowledgeable experts.
Even for the best of us.
So what's the takeaway here? Should we just ignore experts altogether?
Not at all. Experts still have valuable knowledge and insight.